We don't live in Australia, but would you say this is one of the largest scandals, or one of the most well-known scandals in Australia?
It's kind of like Australia's Enron. It's huge. For the last 35 years, every journalist who has learned about this subject makes it their life's work to try and find Michael Hand and to try and solve this mystery. For us, it's a bit like finding out who killed JFK. It's a big mystery down here, and it's not every day you have a bank that turns out to have had such close associations with a major intelligence agency slap bang in the centre of your city. Sydney back then was a little bit like Idaho Falls is now. It was a fairly quiet place. We didn't know big-time criminals. We didn't know about the heroin trade, and I can remember as a young man it was a fairly naive town, and I think that's what Nugan Hand exploited. They came into this country and they basically played on the fact that our police force never expected a merchant bank with men wearing suits would be laundering the proceeds of drug trafficking and helping fund black operations for an intelligence agency on the other side of the world.
The Australian authorities and FBI really haven't pursued him. Why do you think that is?
Oh, I think the evidence is irrefutable that the American intelligence agencies did not want Michael Hand found. Michael Hand, by the way, is a highly decorated war hero. He's thought of very, very highly by a lot of the people that we've spoken to. He's a Green Beret. He was in one of the defining battles of the Vietnam War, Dong Xuai, where he won a Distinguished Service Cross, which is one below your Medal of Honor. He's a very brave, very courageous man, and his service should be recognised. The problem is that he also had this role in covert operations. We've got documents that show that a year after he fled Australia in 1982, Michael Hand was in Honduras training almost certainly guerrillas who were going into Nicaragua to fight the Nicaraguan Sandinista rebels. And it's interesting because he was clearly working for the CIA during that period. And so a lot of the documents that we have obtained from our intelligence archives show that our intelligence services knew where he was, but they couldn't get cooperation from either the CIA, your FBI, or any of the intelligence services to track him down and bring him to justice, because essentially I think he was a protected species. The attitude was he was a Cold War warrior, he was a guy who did his bit to fight communism, and I think he's been allowed to have a quiet retirement in Idaho Falls.
At just 6 minutes after 11 a.m. local time, the signing began. Each of the men had to place his signature on the documents 32 times. Secretary Rogers seemed to have a little trouble finding a pen that would write, but he finally succeeded. And with that scratch of a pen, the American involvement in Vietnam was over, and America's longest war was ended. What was being signed was the agreement itself calling for an end to the fighting, and 3 protocols dealing with an international control commission, a joint military commission, and the return of prisoners of war. The document itself does not mention any of the signatory countries by name. It just refers to the parties participating in the Paris Conference on Vietnam. It was the formula to avoid having the South Vietnamese and the Provisional Revolutionary Government recognize each other.
From the beginning, the pilots, particularly those who were involved in the covert operations side of the flying, were aware that they were at least working for the Central Intelligence Agency. There was no attempt ever to disguise this. The secret was the ownership of the company, and there was only a handful, a dozen people perhaps, out of several hundred that would know that the company was in fact owned by the Central Intelligence Agency.
The largest operation undertaken by Air America was the secret war in Laos, which was largely a byproduct of the war in neighboring Vietnam. Of particular interest to American strategists was North Vietnam's principal supply route into South Vietnam, the Ho Chi Minh Trail, an ever-changing network of roads and mountain trails which crossed many times into Laos. In northern Laos, the North Vietnamese met fierce resistance from an army of guerrilla fighters whose ranks were predominantly from a hill tribe called the Mayo, but who called themselves the Hmong. Under their leader Vang Pao, the Hmong were fighting a valiant but unsuccessful battle to protect their homeland.
The United States saw the Hmong as being able to act as surrogates in terms of not having to introduce American troops into the area. So the Central Intelligence Agency gave the Hmong training and modern arms. This guerrilla army of Hmong tribesmen was going to be supported in their mountaintop bases by an aerial network of Air America helicopters and short takeoff and landing airplanes.
Meantime, Patrick O'Brien was bagging big-time criminals. He gathered enough evidence to have Mr. Asia himself, Marty Johnston, arrested for selling him heroin.
No one sort of said, oh wow, we've caught Mr. Asia, let's fucking lock them away. It was just, we just caught some guy selling me heroin.
Before they could be placed on trial, Johnston and his associates skipped the country.
While on bail, everyone that had been charged left the country. And so there was never ever a court case. These people were never ever convicted of those offences.
It was hugely frustrating for police, especially for the agents who'd been set up as flies in the web. Patrick had played a key role in almost bringing members of New Zealand's most feared drug ring to justice. Thousands of lives had been wrecked in Mr. Asia's slipstream, and many more shattered as the key players continued their operation from overseas.
Donald Mackay, the heroic family man who decided to take on the mafia, didn't get his chance to name names. On July 15, 1977, Donald Mackay's car was found in this pub car park. He had left his furniture store for a quick beer after work. Police found 3 bullet cases, his keys, and a pool of blood. His body was nowhere to be seen, and to this day has never been found.
Had obviously been murdered and disposed of by an organised crime group. It was historic. I don't think anything like that had ever happened in Australian history, and I think probably Australia grew up a little bit that day.
When the police first came to see me, I just knew straight away when they told me what they'd found that Don had gone. I know that many people in high places say publicly there is no such thing as organised crime and corruption in New South Wales. Now, if they think that that's what the ordinary people in the street believe, they're right out of touch.
2 years after the disappearance of Donald Mackay, the town of Griffith was turned upside down when the Woodward Royal Commission was set up to investigate drug trafficking and Mackay's murder. Attempts from the press to interview some of those named were met with hostility.
We're looking for Dominic.
Yeah, hi Dominic.
Dominic Sergi.
Yeah, what do you want?
You're the one that was in the Royal Commission.
Put it in my sin there, alright?
No.
Put it in my sin there, alright? I'll put it in the car. Stop. I'm going to put it in the car.
Why won't you answer the
Shut up. Oh.
It was 10 years after the assassination of Don Mackay before James Bazley was convicted of conspiring to murder him. But true to the Mafia code of silence, Bazley told the police nothing. He served 15 years. Also named in the Woodward Royal Commission, but never put away, was Robert Trimboli. He fled to Ireland. As attempts were made to extradite him back to Australia to face charges in 1987, Trimboli turned up dead in Spain. He was brought back to Australia for burial.
Now what? Get it away, all right?
Trimboli's funeral in Sydney is best remembered for the absurd punch-up between members of the family and the media.
Oh, wait, yeah. Get up, Scotty. Get up. Get out! Stop! Come on, hey. Come on, hey. Come on, hey. Stop it! Come on! Pretty hard way down the buck, isn't it?
In recent years, there have been charges from time to time that the CIA has involved itself in illegal activities. Some of the most bizarre to date involve a bank in Australia known as Nugan Hand. And tonight, Gary Shepherd has a report.
When the Nugan Hand Bank of Sydney, Australia collapsed in 1980, it appeared at first glance to be just another bank failure. But after Australian authorities began taking a closer look, they discovered a tangled web of intrigue with all the elements of a best-selling spy novel. A mysterious death, the body later dug up from its grave, illegal currency transactions, big-time drug operations, and the Central Intelligence Agency.
We were to become the paymasters for the CIA around the world. In other words, we were putting ourselves in the position to disperse funds for the CIA to whoever they were directed.
Former bank executive Neil Evans, given immunity from prosecution, agreed to talk about the Nugan Hand operation on Australian television. From his account and others, the bank had its genesis during the Vietnam War. 4 of the original stockholders were Americans who listed their addresses as Air America, Army Post Office, San Francisco. Air America was the CIA airline in Indochina, hauling men and supplies on clandestine missions. And according to former CIA agents, even drugs out of the so-called Golden Triangle, where the borders of Burma, Laos, and Thailand converge. Nugan Hand sent Neil Evans to the Thai city of Chiang Mai, the commercial center of the drug trade. He claims the CIA made millions and used the money to finance some of its secret projects.
The idea was that money would be deposited with the Nugan Hand Bank by the CIA through various channels, and also that the Nugan Hand Bank would be the repository for funds coming in from various CIA enterprises, namely drugs in Thailand, marijuana in particular, and that the Nugan Hand Bank would then be responsible for rerouting that money to an account in America with a New York bank.
Nugan Hand was not your ordinary bank. There were secret numbered accounts, and hardly any of its top people were bankers. Many were American civilians and former high-ranking military officers with ties to U.S. intelligence. When they found the body of Australian businessman Frank Nugan, the bank's chairman, shot to death a few months before the bank went under, they discovered in his pocket the business card of this man, William Colby, former director of the CIA. Nugan's partner was Michael Hand, an American Green Beret, who served 2 tours in Vietnam, one of them for the Central Intelligence Agency. He disappeared a short while after the bank collapsed and is now believed to be dead.
Australian newspapers reported a connection between Nugan Hand and the U.S. Navy's super-secret intelligence unit known as Task Force 157. Among its top agents, CIA man Edwin Wilson, now under indictment for selling arms and explosives to Libyan dictator Muammar Gaddafi. And a man named Patry Loomis has also been implicated. He was the apparent CIA Nugan Hand go-between. It was Loomis who helped Wilson recruit a team of Green Berets to train terrorists in Libya.
The Nugan Hand affair has caused an uproar in Australia, where authorities are trying to find out what involvement the bank might have had in the 1975 downfall of the Labour Party government. Meanwhile, investigators on 3 continents are attempting to trace $50 million missing from the accounts of depositors, including many Americans. Here in this country, the CIA denies any involvement with drug operations in Indochina, the Nugan Hand Bank itself, or the deaths of the 2 men who ran it. Gary Shepard, CBS News, Los Angeles.